Okay, let's dive into this really complex figure, Jomo Kenyatta.
Hmm,
Because on one hand, you have this image, right? The celebrated father of independent Kenya, powerful anti-colonial voice.
absolutely. The independence hero.
But then there's this other side, serious accusations of authoritarianism, maybe even oppression.
Huh.
A leader who critics say benefited a select few.
And it's that clash, that stark contrast that makes him so fascinating and frankly quite troubling to grapple with.
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive looking at historical analyses, biographical accounts, trying to get a handle on this duality.
Yeah, our mission, if you like, isn't just to list the good and the bad. It's more about understanding how these seemingly opposite narratives actually coexist in one person's legacy.
And what that tells us about, well, about nation building after colonialism. It's a tough process.
It really is. The challenges are immense.
Right. So let's go back to the beginning. Kenyatta, born Kamau Wangengi, around 1897, in a Kikuyu village.
That's right. And his early life was just steeped in the reality of British colonialism. You can't overstate the impact.
We're talking about land dispossession, right? A huge issue for the Kikuyu.
Massive. Their ancestral lands being taken away, plus forced labor, the disruption of their whole way of life, their culture.
It must have bred deep resentment.
Undoubtedly. That experience of oppression, particularly the land alienation, it's fundamental. It really fuels so much of what comes later, his activism.
Okay, then fast forward a bit. He goes to London in the 1920s. This feels like a really pivotal moment.
Oh, absolutely. A turning point.
He's getting educated, he's absorbing Pan-African ideas, meeting people like Kwame
Real
Nkrumah.
influential figures, yeah. And he starts advocating, really articulating the demands for Kenyan rights.
Like getting the land back, demanding fair treatment,
Yeah,
all on an international stage now.
exactly. London gave him the intellectual framework, the language, and crucially, the networks to take these local Kenyan grievances and frame them as part of a larger anti-colonial struggle.
So it wasn't just about Kenya anymore.
Well, it was about Kenya, but placed within that broader Pan-African context. Connecting with Nkrumah and others, it shaped his vision for a free Africa, not just a free Kenya.
Makes sense. So he returns to Kenya, it's 1947. He gets involved, takes a leading role in KANU, the Kenya African National Union.
Right, and KANU becomes the main vehicle, really, for the independence push.
And this feels like a shift, doesn't it? From, say, writing pamphlets in London to direct political organizing back home, a confrontation brewing.
Definitely an escalation. The mood in Kenya was changing, too. There was this growing impatience, this real desire for self-rule.
And Kenyatta tapped into that.
He did. He could articulate that desire, that vision of unity, of a future free from colonial rule. And his time abroad gave him a certain stature, some international recognition, which helped solidify his leadership within KANU.
Okay, but then things get much more intense with the Mau Mau uprising, 1952 to 1960.
A very violent, very significant period.
Driven largely by those same Kikuyu land grievances we talked about.
Primarily, yes, though other factors were involved too, but land was central. And the British response was, well, brutal. Mass arrests, concentration camps, harsh tactics.
Now, Kenyatta's connection to Mau Mau is complex, right?
Yeah.
He always denied ordering the violence.
He did. Publicly, he distanced himself from the armed struggle aspect. But his core message, land reform, challenging colonial authority, clearly resonated with the Mau Mau fighters.
So the British saw him as linked, regardless of his denials.
Oh, absolutely. For the colonial authorities, his leadership of the nationalist movement, his focus on land, it was all seen as part of the same threat. He became a prime target.
Which explains his arrest in 1952, charged with managing the Mau Mau.
That was the charge, yes. And he spent nearly a decade in prison.
It's fascinating, though. That imprisonment didn't crush his image. If anything, it seems to have elevated it. He emerges as this huge national hero.
It's a common dynamic, isn't it? Imprisonment by the oppressor often turns political leaders into martyrs, symbols of resistance. His suffering became a rallying point.
A symbol of colonial injustice.
Exactly. It galvanized the independence movement even further. His defiance, even while locked up, was powerful.
And the Mau Mau uprising itself, despite being militarily suppressed, it did push things forward.
I think most historians agree it played a crucial role. It showed the depth of Kenyan resistance and, perhaps more importantly for the British, it highlighted the cost, financial and human, of maintaining control.
Made colonialism unsustainable.
It certainly contributed to that calculation. It forced the British to accelerate their plans for decolonization in the early 60s.
Okay, so that leads us to 1963. Independence. A massive moment for Kenya.
Huge, a moment of incredible hope and celebration.
And Kenyatta is right there at the center. First prime minister, then becomes the first president in 64.
Mm-hmm. And initially, there's a lot of praise, right, for unifying the country, managing a relatively peaceful transition compared to some other places.
He had this vision, didn't he? Economic development, national unity, African pride.
Yes, the rhetoric was powerful. Forging a new Kenyan identity, moving beyond tribal divisions, building a prosperous nation. It was genuinely inspiring for many.
But, and there often seems to be a but in these stories. That initial promise, that optimism, it starts to encounter problems. The narrative shifts.
It does. We begin to see a consolidation of power. More power flowing towards Kenyatta himself and his close circle of allies.
The beginnings of a more authoritarian style. What were the signs?
Well, things like the weakening of checks and balances, less tolerance for political opposition, that initial focus on unity started to look more like enforcing conformity, perhaps.
And the institutions meant to support democracy maybe didn't get as strong a footing.
That's a key part of it. Power became increasingly centralized in the executive branch around the president.
Which brings us squarely to the criticisms.
Yeah.
One of the big ones is ethnic favoritism. The idea that his own ethnic group, the Kikuyu, benefited disproportionately.
Yes, that's a persistent and serious accusation. People point to the concentration of Kikuyu individuals in key government posts in the economy and access to resources.
And that created tension with other groups like the Luo, the Luya.
Absolutely. It led to perceptions of marginalization, of Kikuyu dominance. It definitely fueled resentment and undermined that initial goal of national unity. Sowed seeds of future conflict, really.
Okay, alongside that, there's the suppression of political dissent.
This is another dark aspect. Opposition parties were eventually banned.
Banned outright.
Yes, making Kenya effectively a one-party state for a long time. And critical voices faced intimidation, sometimes imprisonment.
And worse, right? There were suspicious deaths. People like Tom Mboya, a prominent Luo politician seen as a potential rival.
Indeed. Mboya's assassination in 1969 was a major shock. And there were others, particularly those with more leftist or socialist leanings, who were targeted or sidelined. It created a climate of fear for opponents.
So the space for democratic debate just shrank.
Significantly. The government often used the justification of maintaining stability, preventing ethnic divisions, but the effect was to silence opposition.
Then there's the whole issue of a political dynasty. His son, Uhuru Kenyatta, eventually becomes president years later.
Yes, and that continuity of the Kenyatta family in power raises questions for many. Was the independence struggle meant to replace one elite with another?
Did it really break down those old power structures?
Or did it, in some ways, just reconfigure them? It's a criticism you hear that it undermined the democratic ideals that so many fought for.
And finally, corruption and economic inequality. This seems tied into the favoritism issue.
Very much so.
Huh.
While the Kenyan economy did grow in some sectors under Kenyatta, like agriculture and infrastructure,
The benefits weren't shared equally.
far from it, according to critics. There are widespread accounts of corruption, of state resources being diverted, and the land issue comes back again.
The promise of redistribution wasn't fulfilled.
Largely not in the way many had hoped. A lot of the best land formerly held by white settlers ended up in the hands of Kenyatta's allies, his family, people close to the regime.
So the gap between the rich and poor widened.
Yes, significant wealth disparities emerged and persisted, and the fact that the Kenyatta family itself became one of the wealthiest in Kenya became a major point of criticism. It seemed a betrayal of the independence promise for many ordinary Kenyans.
Wow. So when you put it all together, it's such a mixed bag. Father of the nation, independence leader, Pan-Africanist voice.
Involved in founding the OAU, the Organization of African Unity.
Right. But then authoritarian ruler, ethnic favoritism, political repression, corruption. How do people reconcile these two Kenyattas?
It's incredibly difficult, and opinions remain sharply divided in Kenya and among historians. He embodies these contradictions, the pressures of holding a newly independent, diverse nation together.
Maybe led to choices that compromise the initial ideals.
That's one interpretation, that the demands of state building in that context led down a path towards authoritarianism and inequality. It's a pattern seen elsewhere, unfortunately.
And those failures, especially on land and inequality, they didn't just disappear when he died. They cast a long shadow.
A very long shadow. Those issues continue to be major challenges in Kenya today. The patterns of political patronage, the dynasties, they have deep roots going back to that era.
So in a way, Kenyatta becomes almost an archetype. The liberation hero who gets power and then gets entangled in the problems of power, maybe even replicates some of the systems they fought against.
It's a compelling, if tragic, archetype.
Mm,
His story is definitely one of heroism in the independence struggle, no doubt. But for many, it's also a story of deep disappointment and how that power was ultimately used.
that duality again,
Yeah.
liberation and the darker side of governance.
Precisely, which is why he remains such a pivotal, debated figure. You can't understand modern Kenya without grappling with his legacy in all its complexity.
So, thinking about this whole deep dive,
Hmm.
what does Kenyatta's story really tell us, do you think? About the sheer difficulty of post-colonial leadership, about building nations that are both stable and fair.
Hmm. It highlights the immense pressures, the hard choices, the potential pitfalls, how the ideals of liberation can clash with the realities of governing.
It really makes you, the listener, consider, which part of this legacy stands out most? The hero, the oppressor? Or is it impossible to separate them? It forces you to look closely at the history, the sources, and all those messy contradictions.